Hello everyone, we're at the grand opening of the 2016 Ignite Conference, and we are inducting this book, Measuring and Managing Information Risk, A Fair Approach into the Cybersecurity Canon. And we have the two authors here in studio with us, Jack Jones and Jack Freund. Guys, welcome and thanks for coming.
Thank you for having us.
And congratulations for getting this award.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you all have tackled, I think, one of the biggest problems, the biggest blind spots that we've had in the industry since I started doing this. And that is, how do you assess risk, right? And your book talks about establishing some rigor in that entire process. I've been doing this for years. I just kind of make it up as I go, but you're going to make me, do math and things. So tell me how you started to get this done.
Well, first, I submit that we're not going to make anybody do math. Right?
Thank goodness.
The framework, FAIR, enables good, solid math. But a lot of organizations, a lot of people who use FAIR use it qualitatively. They use it, sometimes they don't even take it there. They just use it as a way to normalize terminology, normalize people's mental models, and as a framework for critical thinking so that they're not just coming up with stuff, without thinking through it. Right?
Well, I mean, you say that, right? One of the things you say in the book is that it's doing a risk assessment without any accurate analysis, right? We're just kind of making it up on the fly, right?
Yeah. So if you think about the opposite of that, if you think about practicing risk in an unrigorous, unscientific way, as bad a connotation as that has, I think what we're really talking about is relying on our instinct, that accumulated years of experience that we have to make a good decision. Really, it's common sense. And the problem with common sense is that while it allows us to provide a narrative around the way the world works, it undermines our ability to understand how it works. And that's really what we provided with FAIR, is a model to help people understand the way that risk works in bite-sized miniature pieces. It allows us to sort of decompose the problem into measurable pieces.
I think it's one of the big evolutions in our industry, is that people like us are coming to the realization that we're not trying to protect against cyber attacks. We're really trying to protect organizations or reduce the risk to our organizations, right? And as cybersecurity professionals, this is something we should be good at, and we really suck at this, right? Right? We have a hard time assessing it. We have a hard time convincing people what it is, right?
Yeah. And there is a skill set that will excel at this sort of thing. I think anybody can do it. But as with any other skill, some people are going to be really good at it. They're going to be wired for analysis. They're going to be, their critical thinking mental muscles, they're probably been applying them all along, right? Those people are going to take to this like ducks to water. Other people, it won't be as natural to them, but it can still be very helpful to them in thinking through the problems and making sure that their own mental models are calibrated and they're not overlooking things or over-biasing things and those sorts of things.
So I think it's really, for old guys like me who've been trying to learn new things, right? I learned what these terms are, and you define them. You define terms like threat frequency and vulnerability and loss magnitude with some precision, right? So there can be no ambiguity about what we mean when we say that. Can you talk about why you thought that was important?
Well, if you don't have that sort of precision in terms in order to define the problems that you're trying to analyze, there's no way on earth you're going to put good measurements against them. I can't. So you've heard the phrase, what gets measured gets managed. Mm. Well, you can't measure something you haven't defined clearly, right? And when people say, I will hear people say, "Oh, I tried FAIR. FAIR's hard," right? And I'll talk to them about it, and they won't have grasped that fundamental need to get real clarity around what it is they're trying to put numbers to or qualitative labels to, that sort of thing. And so they struggle, and then they say, well, it's hard. And it's really not.
Well, I think that's the big revelation for me when I read the book, was that it is possible to get to some precision, even though some of these things are really hard to measure. Absolutely. But you can get a better idea than saying, well, I think it's this, right? So how did you get to that point where you figured that out? How did you know? Because you're an old guy too, Jack, like me. How did you figure that out?
Pain and suffering, and lots of mistakes. When I was first trying to figure this stuff out, I was fumbling and making mistakes, and I have old notes and such from the early days of developing this stuff, and I look back at them and just it's embarrassing, how bad some of that stuff was. And fortunately for me, I was willing to be self-critical. I was curious and persistent, right? And really looking for something that would pass a laugh test or smell test, right? And finally that, actually started to happen. You'd be quizzed or you'd be poked and prodded by people who were skeptical, right? And finally, it got to the point where I could defend this against anybody who cared to throw stones.
See, I think it's, go ahead.
Oh, I'll say, but that's what scientific inquiry does for us. It causes us to challenge precisely the way we think that the world works in order to make a defensible argument about something. And that's as complicated as it may seem on the outside. The variables that we talk about with FAIR are really decomposed versions of what you learn for a basic CISP exam. You have to learn that basic ALE equation. But the problem is when you go to apply that, you never know where to get the numbers from.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in situations where, we had these great algorithms that we put in a spreadsheet, right? And we crank all these numbers out, but it was based on some really wrong assumptions.
Exactly.
Right?
So what analysts will do is they'll pick a very large number for how bad it could be, and they'll choose a probability based upon what they want the outcome to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the time.
So those decomposed variables give you measurable pieces to help describe things better.
And the framework is also marvelous at poking and prodding at people's risk statements. I mean, this is going to sound like I have a bad attitude or whatever the case might be, or that I'm mean, right? But an auditor or a regulator or consultant when I was a CSO would sit across from me and say, "Oh, these things are high risk." I'd say, "Really? Tell me about that." And I would start just quizzing them. How did you arrive at this? And drilling into it. They could never stand behind it. They would always back down. And in fact, over the last 2 years or so, as I've been going into organizations and working with them, 70 to 90% of the time, depending on the organization, that someone says something is high risk, when I start poking and prodding, they can't stand behind it. It goes away. It becomes low or medium. And when that's the case, we talked about prioritization. When 70 to 90% of your high risk stuff isn't, there's no way you know what's really important and are managing. And I hear people saying, "Oh, we're losing the cyber war." Well, of course we are. If we can't prioritize correctly and we're misspending our limited resources and that sort of thing, of course we're going to lose that war.
So in other talk we're having here at Ignite, I like to say that the primary mission for all network defenders is to prevent high-risk material impact to our organizations, right? But if we have no way to tell what the high risk is, like you were saying, then you are wasting your time, spending lots of money on things that are never going to affect you, or at least have no impact to your organization. All right, so it's really a question of, I'm going to back up. Why don't we just tell everybody what FAIR is? I'm halfway through the interview and we haven't really told anybody what that is.
Now we have to explain it. All right. So it's essentially a decomposition, as Jack said. It's a codification of what risk is and how it works. It's a Bayesian network, just a tree structure, if you will, a root structure with risk at the top and two components: loss of event frequency and loss of magnitude, and then the things that contribute to those and the things that contribute to those. So that it's essentially giving you, again, this framework for critical thinking, for dissecting what are otherwise very complicated problems, right? And making sense of it, making sure you're not overlooking things and such. And it also then, because it's in that structure, it defines the relationship between these elements. And that's one, I think, critical difference between FAIR and a lot of the other models or frameworks that are out there. You hear about taxonomies all the time. ISO has taxonomy, NIST has taxonomy. Taxonomies put things into categories, right? But they don't define the relationships to one another. So FAIR is an ontology. It not only provides these categories, if you will, but also defines the relationships between them, some of which are Boolean of one sort or another, these sorts of things. And that allows you to do the kind of analytics that allows you to measure this stuff.
I will tell you that I did not understand the difference between ontology and taxonomy until I read your book, all right? So thank you for getting that done for me, all right? So it gets down to defining our terms, all right? So you guys say this, that risk equates to loss exposure. Is that fair? Okay. And so then the definition of risk is the probable frequency and probable magnitude of future loss. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And that's that definition, I spent a lot of time thinking about that before I chose those words in that sentence. And first of all, that's what we're tasked with helping organizations manage, is future loss, right? And there's a frequency component and a magnitude component. That's fairly obvious. But both of those are probabilities. The reason I put probable in front of both frequency and magnitude is to emphasize, and I've been criticized for this, but it's there to emphasize the fact that these are probability statements. There is no absolute certainty around it. I mean, we can be as scientific and rigorous as we like. We can have data out our backsides, right? And we still can't foretell the future, right? Yes. We can have a better understanding of what is most likely, right? It's about probability.
So I was told.
Go ahead. No.
I was told one time that I got the equation wrong because I had probability on both sides of the equation. That it has probability times impact. Obviously, you don't know what I'm talking about. And I said, no, that's correct because I don't know either one of those answers. Absolutely. So there's an uncertainty that we can only measure with probability that exists on both sides of those things.
Well, I think one of the reasons we're really bad at this as a community, right, is we don't factor in the frequency component. Okay, so we can guess on how bad something might be when it happens. Right?
And what we do though, when we do add the frequency in, here's what happens. What I see over and over and over again is they'll take worst case impact. That's what we'll focus on, right?
Yeah.
People in our industry, worst case focus. And then for frequency, we'll take the most common instance, right? And you throw those two things together and you grossly blow up the risk statement. I mean, it's completely inaccurate at that point.
No, but I often say that we exist as an industry for probably, as many events as we can count on, maybe 3 hands. Like those really big, long tail events are why we exist. The common everyday sort of things we handle, we move on. Nobody loses a lot of money from them. There's no loss associated with them. But management invariably sees that there is some big boogeyman out there of a big loss amount. So risk is always about loss. It has to be.
Has to be.
And those lists of risk that talk about assets, like I saw a list one time, and we talk about it in the book. VoIP is a big risk.
Right.
I was like, no, I refuse. I refuse to be threatened by inanimate technology. It's just a thing. I could use it to do great things and to provide value for my organization. But people that misuse it could cause loss to the organization.
I say the same thing about insider risk, insider threat.
Sure.
Okay, everybody's afraid of that, but the frequency is, there's not a lot of data on that. So how can you be afraid of it, right?
It does tend to be pretty low.
Yeah. To your point, so something we're doing regularly now with organizations is helping them either establish or review their top 10 risks, and invariably, every single company I go into, their list of top 10 risks are a mashup of technologies, threat communities,
credit cards,
control deficiencies, right? Never a loss event.
No.
Never a loss. The closest thing you'll get for a loss event is data leakage, right? Not specific enough to be all that useful from a measurement perspective. And so they have this list of things, and I'll ask them, I'll say, okay, this top 10 list, which one's your top one? And they're like, I don't know. I say, well, what was number 11 that didn't make the list?
Yeah, I know.
Right?
Yeah.
And why didn't it make the list?
Right.
And they have no answer whatsoever, right? There's no way these people can defend their top 10 lists.
So FAIR can help you get there is the point. And so that's going to make our jobs easier. You won't feel uneasy going to the board. You'll know the answers to that. That's what I like about it. All right. So one of the things you said in the book, which I really like, you said that doing a risk analysis is deductive, a la Sherlock Holmes, right? I really like the idea that I could be compared to Sherlock Holmes.
Someday.
So tell me what you mean by deductive reasoning here.
So when you think about analytic models, what people are most commonly thinking of is things like insurance models and such, where they have boatloads of data gathered over millennia, right? And they look at the data and they can say, okay, the data, when we move it around, it says the world works like this. Okay, so here's our model. Well, building FAIR, I didn't have that kind of data.
Right.
That's an inductive model when you're deriving your model from data, right? When you don't have that, there's a way to deductively arrive at your model, and that's simply say, what is it we're trying, in this case, what is it we're trying to analyze? Risk. What is it comprised of? Well, loss event frequency and loss magnitude. What's loss event frequency comprised of? Well, threat event frequency and vulnerability to those threat events. So it's just deducing from, at each layer, the layer below. And so that's really what that means. And there are pros and cons to inductive versus deductive reasoning, or
They're both
or
valid,
models.
but
They're both valid,
Yeah, yeah.
and both have their strengths and weaknesses. But when you don't have data, right, you have to work deductively. And as we begin to apply the model, and we're seeing that all the time, as we do more and more of these analyses and get more data, it allows us to refine probability statements and that sort of thing, refine the model, and so you get the best of both worlds.
So it touches. Oh, go ahead, Jack.
And I think all this challenge that you talk about, Jack, about challenging auditors for their statements, that's deductive as well. You start from this higher level. This is a high risk thing, and FAIR gives you a language to sort of interrogate and ask questions about that.
Exactly.
So is it high risk because it's happening all the time, or because we're going to lose a lot of money if it does? So you think it's happening all the time? Is those frequency of loss or frequency of attack? And those help ask very pointed questions, help you measure things better.
Yeah, and it makes you think about what you're trying to protect. The things you're trying to protect,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah. So we touched on this a little bit, but now you're coming back around to it. You mentioned that in the book that you don't like being called a predictor. You'd much rather be called a forecaster. So talk about why we need that distinction.
Yeah, that's really making the work that we're doing more palatable to management. We make predictions all day long. We're in Las Vegas now, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of predictions being made about sporting events, political races, economics, public policy.
Who's going to win the Canon Award tonight?
I have no
I'm
idea.
sure there's a line for that.
So we'll take the spread on that, I'm sure. So, our eagerness to make predictions is probably only matched by our reluctance to be held accountable when those predictions don't come true.
That's true.
But it's not so much about making good but whether we can make good or bad predictions, but really identifying the things about which we're able to reliably make a prediction for. And I think using a term like forecasting relieves management of the expectation of precision. And I think that's a really important thing, because I can't tell you exactly when you're going to be breached, when you're going to have cyber events happen to your organization. But we can put a range around it. And that's sometimes enough, oftentimes enough, for management to make good decisions about what they want to spend money on.
Certainly better than red.
Right.
Anytime
now.
Wait, I use that on my
Often.
charts all the time. So.
We do too.
Yeah.
There's a place for qualitative and such. And a lot of times management likes it really simple. Give me a color. Red tells me I have to pay attention to this, right? And great. So knowing that about management, when they're like that, that's what I'll do. I'll give them what they're looking for. But underneath that is going to be the analytics and the numbers. I can back that color up. Right? There's going to be, red is going to be specifically defined, explicitly defined as to what it means, what ranges fall within red, so that if somebody wants to dig deep, we can defend it.
I like to say that FAIR gives you a discipline for how you choose high, medium, low, red, yellow, and green.
It gives you,
So
it gives you the precision to do
everything that red that comes out of your group is going to have this rigorous approach to how we pick it, and it's going to mean something. And it's not going to be the kind of thing that you're accused of being a Chicken Little for. You're going to have reliable expertise. Yeah.
So what I really like about the book is that you guys have opened it up to outside inspection. Okay, it's not two crazy guys come up with an idea about how to do stuff. You've opened it up with your own standard, given it to a standards body, and I want to know, can you guys talk about why that's important?
Well, it's important because this is a big problem in our industry, right? And in order to evolve, if I had kept it proprietary, which people had encouraged me to patent it and all that good stuff, right? And I just thought that was wrong, for one thing. But on the other hand, too, there were challenges with that, because if FAIR is an accurate codification of risk, right, then that, trying to put a patent around it would be like Copernicus trying to patent his observations of the solar system. That wouldn't make any sense, right? And probably wouldn't get approved. But it putting it out there in that group allows it to be more publicly kicked around, poked and prodded and evaluated, and make sure it stands up. So, and the analogy I've been using recently that I think it should be meaningful, hopefully, to our audience is, you wouldn't use proprietary encryption, right? Everybody knows that's typically a bad idea. I mean, someone's proprietary encryption could be amazing, but probably not.
Probably.
Right? And the same with risk analysis and models, right? I mean, if someone's model is proprietary and held back, or so complicated that it takes a PhD to understand it, you really want to think hard about what's going on there. And so really it's this notion of, all right, let's put it out there, let's people poke and prod, and if if it's broken in some important fashion, I want to know that so
Sure.
it can be fixed. I don't want to put some useless piece of garbage in front of people and having them make worse decisions than they already are, right? So,
well, I think it's the best thing for it. It's fantastic you guys did that. So we're about out of time, but I just want to say publicly that I think this is the future. We were talking about this before this video thing began. We are really bad at this as a community. You guys have given us a path to get better at this, so thank you for doing that. Congratulations on being inducted into the Canon tonight, and thanks for coming and doing this interview. I appreciate it.